think the thing I love most about Quentin Tarantino's movies is that they all have this incredible propulsive energy to them. The number one rule of filmmaking is don't be boring, and I don't think I've ever been bored for a minute of any of Tarantino's movies. And he makes long movies. Not to say I loved every second of The Hateful Eight, or that I'm as high on Django as I was when I was 23, but even if I don't love every movie, moment to moment, I'm always engaged, and I'm always so excited about what's going to happen next. And that's the best way I can describe it. His movies have this propulsive energy that I don't really find from other writers or directors with the same consistency. However, if I'm being honest, I think it's easier to be engaging if there's a violent undercurrent to the movie. Not easy, but easier. If it's a possibility that violence could erupt at any moment, when there's that ever-present sense of danger, that's implicitly going to be more tense and exciting. And, look at what each of his movies are about. A jewel heist gone horribly wrong, hitmen, a money runner for a dangerous gangster, an assassin out for revenge, vehicular homicide, hunting Jews and killing Nazis, an ex-slave bounty hunter, and a hangman in a murder mystery. If I were more cynical, I might call it a crutch. But luckily I'm not a cynic, because the truth is, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of movies have violent undercurrents, but very few movies engage me or excite me as much as Tarantino's. So there must be something else going on. And I think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is proof of that. For most of the runtime, there isn't really that undercurrent of violence, that sense of danger. Yeah, eventually there is, and I will get to that, but it's a 2-hour, 40-minute movie, and an hour 40 of it has no imminent threats. I heard a lot of comparisons to Jackie Brown when the movie first came out, that it's Tarantino's most mature movie since Jackie Brown. And I think that the violence and danger aspect is at the heart of this observation. Not that Jackie Brown isn't violent or dangerous, or Della's a scary character and someone gets shot in the face in the first 40 minutes. And not that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood isn't violent either. It very much is, but just for a small chunk. But I just went through his filmography. When it comes to violent movies, we're talking a sliding scale here. My point is just that the threat of violence doesn't hang over every scene like in some of his other movies. I've heard people describe Once Upon a Time as a hangout movie, and I completely agree and wholeheartedly mean that as a compliment. It creates a world that you want to explore and spend time in, and characters that are far from perfect, but that you just want to be around. Or at least I do. Maybe not everyone does. I'll get to that. And for the most part, the movie lets you just spend time in the world and be around the characters. It's not very plotty, and there's a not insubstantial amount of time just spent driving around 1969 LA with characters listening to 1969 LA radio. I mean, the second act literally ends with two characters hanging out in the living room, drinking beer, and watching a TV show together. The plot, such as it is, simply follows three characters who all work in the film business to varying degrees over the course of 3 days. The first is Rick Dalton, played by Leo DiCaprio, an insecure actor who was once the series lead of an NBC Western, but by now is struggling to maintain his career as a leading man, and realizing that those days might tragically be behind him. The second is Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt, Rick Dalton's former stunt double, who now mostly spends his time driving Rick around, doing work around Rick's house, and generally just being Rick's errand boy. And the third is actress Sharon Tate, played by Margot Robbie, the only non-fictional character of the three. And at this point, I have to mention that the 3 days that the movie follows these characters are February 8th, 1969, February 9th, 1969, and then it fast forwards 6 months for the third act to August 8th, 1969. And if you know anything about Sharon Tate, that third date might ring a bell. I said that there wasn't an undercurrent of violence hanging over every scene in Once Upon a Time, and from moment to moment, based on what's literally happening in the plot, there's not that undercurrent. But at the same time, there kind of is, just by Sharon Tate's very presence in the movie. Again, if you know anything about her, just her being here makes you tense up waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the movie fast forwards 6 months and you see her for the first time and see that she's very pregnant, even though the movie still has a light breezy tone to it at that moment, your stomach drops and you're suddenly terrified for whatever the next 40 minutes has in store. And that's all very intentional. Tarantino's using our knowledge of history against us. The movie isn't inherently tense because Sharon Tate is here, but knowing what her presence means and anticipating what might be coming makes it tense. A friend of mine said that Sharon Tate is a red herring in this movie. because she's kind of only here to make the audience nervous, and she doesn't really interact with the other two main characters. She and her husband Roman Polanski are Rick Dalton's neighbors on Cielo Drive, but their paths don't really cross. And yeah, I see that. Sharon Tate becomes more integrated into Rick and Cliff's story in the third act, but for the first 2/3, she kind of is a red herring. But she's also a person. I remember before this movie came out, a lot of people were understandably nervous about how Tarantino would handle the Sharon Tate and Manson stuff. He's not always the most delicate filmmaker. But one of the major joys of the movie is seeing Sharon Tate just get to be a person. Someone who goes to parties and dances to records and goes to bookstores and is very kind to people, and who is very proud of the work she did as an actor. Her legacy in pop culture and in the public consciousness is one of tragedy, but she's more than her tragedy. She was alive and passionate and a vibrant 26-year-old, and this movie highlights all that. And again, it's a real joy to see. That said, I won't say that Sharon Tate is only here to remind us of her humanity. Yes, she's a person, but also her character does represent a few things. Trying to avoid spoilers, but given how the final moments of the movie play out, she certainly seems to represent something angelic, something otherworldly. I mean, it seems like every time we see her, she's lit with such warm golden light that she practically has a halo the whole movie. And as you watch the ending, look for pearly gates imagery. It's not subtle. Some people cite the Manson murders as the end of the idealistic free love hippie era of the late 60s. So even outside the context of the movie, it could be argued that Sharon Tate and the grisly events that people associate with her represent a time of transition, the symbolic end of the 60s. And within the context of the movie, I think it's very easy to make that argument, given that the whole movie is really about a time of transition. Hollywood was undergoing some radical changes in 1969. This goes unremarked upon in the movie, but 2 titles were released that year that signified major change for the industry. The first was Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, which ushered in the new Hollywood of the 1970s, the American New Wave, bringing about the rise of auteurs like Roman Polanski, Mr. Sharon Tate. And the other was Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which journalist W.K. Stratton called, in many ways, the last Western, signaling the end of the road for actors like Rick Dalton, the former Western TV star. Some background. In 1959, there were 30 Western TV shows on in primetime, 14 of which debuted that year. By 1969, no network was airing new Westerns, and only a small handful of existing shows, like Gunsmoke and Bonanza, limped into the 1970s. Again, none of this is explicitly mentioned in the movie, but it's real historical context to illustrate the changing industry and the demise of this fictional guy's career. And Rick Dalton doesn't handle this career demise very well. One of his defining qualities, other than insecurity, vanity, and alcoholism, is that he hates hippies.
Bunch of goddamn fucking hippies.
He makes mention of it multiple times, and it's played for laughs, but it's really just him lashing out at the kids, telling them to get off his lawn, literally in one case. And he completely lacks the self-awareness to realize that what he's really lashing out at is the changing culture, the culture that's leaving him behind. In 1969, both in the movie and in real life, the Manson family was living at Spahn Ranch north of Los Angeles. Spahn Ranch was one of several ranches up north in the 30-mile zone where they used to film westerns in the 50s and 60s. But by 1969, Spahn and most of the others had closed up shop, for reasons we've already discussed. There's something poetic and also sinister about the Manson family living at Spahn Ranch, a place where they used to make westerns, a place that's representative of Rick and Cliff's career, bustling in the 1960s, but now reduced to a desolate ghost town. It's poetic because their living there literalizes this cultural replacement that Rick is unselfconsciously lashing out against. But it's sinister because, from one perspective, the Manson family is invading hallowed ground of Hollywood history, profaning the sacred, so to speak. And when you look at what the Manson family ultimately did to American culture, particularly in regard to Los Angeles and Hollywood, profaning the sacred is probably the mildest way you could put it. The movie captures this moment in time, this moment of transition, when Rick Dalton's career as a Western actor is on the decline, and Sharon Tate's career as a starlet is on the rise, and they're colliding in the middle. Meanwhile, Cliff Booth's career as a stuntman has long flatlined. Much of the movie is Rick Dalton coming to terms with the fact that his career as a leading man may be over, but Cliff Booth accepted the demise of his career long ago. This is a movie about transition, but also about how characters handle that transition, and how Rick and Cliff accept or don't accept the cards they're dealt is a huge contrast. Even though he may seem like a simple character, Cliff Booth is kinda hard to pin down. There are some ambiguities about his character, specifically about his past, and Tarantino has gone on record saying that these are intentional ambiguities. And depending on how you read said ambiguities, kind of changes what movie you're watching. And that's by design. For that reason, I obviously can't fault anyone who chooses to not give Cliff the benefit of the doubt, but without saying too much, I do give Cliff a bit of a generous read in regard to his past, based on other things we see him do in the movie. We see him be compassionate and kind, sometimes putting himself in grave danger in the process. We see that he has a moral code, and that he's more driven by that code than by opportunism. And even though he certainly has some violent tendencies, and maybe a bit of an ego problem, within the framework of the movie, each time we see him actually get violent, there's always a reason. Some reasons may be more valid than others, but he has his code and he sticks with it. And he lives with the consequences that it brings. Brad Pitt's gonna win an Oscar for this, and I'm personally thrilled about that. But a good friend of mine who knows way more about movies than I do is of the opinion that Brad Pitt is just playing himself. And Brad Pitt even joked about that during his SAG acceptance speech. I would argue that what he's actually doing is engaging with his public persona. He's not necessarily playing Brad Pitt, he's playing the public's idea of Brad Pitt. Effortlessly cool, devastatingly handsome, laid back, charismatic, etc. And him playing Cliff like that might not be a stretch, but it's still a choice. I still need to read the script to see exactly how Cliff is written, but judging from his dialogue and actions and decisions, taken in isolation from the performance, he doesn't strike me as particularly laid back or effortlessly cool on the page. I feel like that's something that Pitt is bringing to the character. He makes Cliff just as charismatic and charming as we all take Brad Pitt to be, even if he does some questionable things and might have a bit of a temper and an ego. Cliff isn't always admirable, but he's always interesting. And by the way, I think DiCaprio is similarly engaging with his public persona as an insecure, try-hard actor. They even kind of wink at his public persona when Rick Dalton makes an offhand comment about the age that women are supposedly over the hill. The very best piece of film criticism or analysis I read this year was Priscilla Page writing about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for Birth Movie's Death. And it's full of spoilers, so only read it if you've seen the movie, but if you have, I urge you to read it. In her opening paragraph, she says that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is, among other things, a film about pop culture as a force that brings people together. It's make-believe and it's memoir. It's Quentin Tarantino's second draft of history. Keep in mind that Tarantino is 6 years old and living in Los Angeles in 1969. He's recreating the LA of his childhood, from the billboards to the radio stations. There are several shots looking up at Cliff Booth as he speeds down Hollywood Boulevard, a nod to young Quentin's literal point of view from the passenger seat. The car that Cliff drives is even the same kind of car that Tarantino's dad drove. The movie is a love letter to Los Angeles, but also to the entertainment industry. Whether it's Sharon Tate in the movie theater, or Cliff listening to his radio, or Rick Dalton on TV, we're all experiencing the same culture. And as Priscilla Page says in her piece, it binds us together into a shared experience. As you watch the movie, count how many times someone watches TV or listens to a record or references loving a TV show as a kid or uses watching a movie with someone as a bonding experience. It's all over this movie.
Mary Alice loves Westerns. Our whole courtship we watch Westerns.
And I know movies about making movies usually valorize them as super important, and this kind of does that, but also kind of demystifies movie making. On the one hand, as Priscilla Page points out, it shows movies as literally life-saving in one sense. But at the same time, it also shows the mundanity of the process. It's people showing up to work, clocking in, making a movie, clocking out, and going home. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of the second act. Rick Dalton making a TV show. And I haven't talked much nuts and bolts in this video. I've spent like 80% of it talking context and subtext and reading between the lines. And I fucking love movies that you can do that with. It's literally my favorite thing. But at the same time, I would still defend this as the kind of movie that you can just sit back and enjoy purely on the surface level. There's a lengthy stretch in the middle where you're basically just watching the TV pilot that Rick Dalton is in the process of filming. And I legitimately forgot that I was watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood because I was so enthralled by this non-existent Lancer TV show starring Timothy Olyphant. I've seen it 3 times now, and I just love it more every time I watch it. It's super funny, it's agonizingly tense at times, and it's just really engrossing and entertaining. And I hope it's clear by now, it's something you can really pull apart and sink your teeth into.